the upper end of what used to be Grandpa Humphrey's bottom. The house was down there 100 yards toward the creek. And the barn was between the house and the end of the bottom. The bottom was an apple. Interstate 79 that you see right there took about half of what Grandpa had as a farm. There used to be, when we were boys, a big beech tree that stood right in here on top of this knoll. And of course we lived back in this hollow, on the head of this hollow.
Oh. We lived back in a cove.
And of course when we came down here, we walked through under that big beech tree, and I remember how I discovered how sound travels. Yeah, well, one morning I came down off of the hill, was coming right along that beech tree, and I looked across Wills Creek over there and saw a man in the wood yard chopping wood. And I could see that axe come down and hit the wood and looked like it stuck in there. And he'd grab it and take it back over his head, and then I'd hear the sound. When I got up to the schoolhouse, I told Mr. Crandall, the best teacher we ever had, the best teacher I ever saw. I told him about it, and he explained it to me. That it took sound a length of time to travel across there from John Newhouse's place to where I was standing.
Down where those willow trees are standing, our great-grandfather had a mill. It was not only a corn mill, but it ground wheat. It was a big mill for those days. And Dad had a brother younger than Dad, a couple of years, Arthur. And Arthur drowned in that mill pond, and of course we heard about that all of our lives, about Arthur drowning in the mill pond.
Yeah, and Grandma said they found a little fella, that's what she said, they found a little fella's hat floating on the mill pond.
Uh-huh. And they knew he was in the mill pond.
Okay.
Oh, Brother Robert here told you about Great-Grandpa Humphrey having a big mill that ground wheat and corn. Well, all these people grew their corn and grew their wheat on these hillsides and cut the wheat with a cradle, and then somebody would come through with a thrashing machine at the time to thrash the wheat, and it was like a social event. Everybody brought their wheat in, and everybody gathered around and helped. And then Great-Grandpa Humphrey had that mill, and that's one of the things I've noticed in looking at the family history. Each generation got poorer. Over in Virginia, it worked that way because when an old man died, he divided all he had between his sons. At times you get poor, so Great-Grandpa Humphreys had that mill and the house here, and that's why our grandpa got such a little bit of property. He just got about 29 acres out of this because he got the mill and the house. See, Great-Grandpa Humphreys owned from about 300 yards down the road here to where you can see where that point comes down way up there. He owned up to where that point comes down there, and then as far as you can see to the tops of these hills back here. That's what he owned here. And at one time he owned over 750 acres. We went to the courthouse and figured it up over on Grapevine. But you see what he did, he gave Grandpa this place with the mill, and he gave Thad that place up there, and he gave Holt that place back there, and each one of them had less every time they divided.
Go.
Just adding a personal story to the thrashing machine. I was about 14 years old and we lived on Riley Branch at that time. And I came across the Card Hill to Willow Creek. I was coming over to my grandmother Burdett's house, and they were thrashing up a creek above my grandmother's house, about a half a mile. And they needed one more hand, and they put me in the barn with a pitchfork to carry the straw off. I was to carry the straw to the back of the barn. When I came out of that barn, you couldn't tell I had a new pair of pants and a new shirt on. I was wet with perspiration, of course, and I just ruined my clothes. They never thought anything about that. They just needed the hand, and they put me in the barn. On my right is Paul Dodge. Paul is Ernestine Humphreys Dodge's husband. Ernestine was our Uncle Robert's daughter. And on my left is Norma, a double first cousin. Your mother is her aunt, and of course your father, her father. Hey, I'll have to stop right.
Oh.
Well, we're double first cousins, Norma and I, because
My mother is your aunt.
I can't put it together.
Go.
Norma and I are double first cousins because my father's sister married your mother's uncle, Norma's father.
All right, we're looking at the mountain between Riley Branch and Wills Creek that we had to cross to pick berries. When we were just kids, say 6 or 7 years, about 4 of us would leave there at 7 o'clock in the morning with our buckets, and we would come over the mountain and up this road right here, down this hollow, and come up and go through Grandpa Humphrey's old farm to our farm, which is back, we're going to see here in a second, back in the head of Wills Creek. And we would fill our buckets and have to walk back home, which was about a 2.5 mile trip each way. I learned not to eat peanut butter and a dry biscuit on the hill because you would almost choke to death because there wasn't any water on that hill. And it was a rough trip. And on the way back to the Riley Branch, we usually lay down about 11:30 or 12, and there was an airplane there that was actually a mail plane. And we would watch for that plane, and we would know what time of day it was and how we were getting along. And we weren't allowed to shake the berry buckets because they settled down, and if they weren't full when you got home, Mom could tell that we'd been romping and playing and having too much fun on that berry hunt picking trip. End of story.
Go. Okay. We've got a picture of the oil well there. Now I'm
Well,
focusing down toward the creek.
you ready for me now?
Yep.
Well, you can see the oil well on Grandma Humphrey's part of this place. It's too bad that they didn't have that little oil well when Grandpa and Grandma were living. So Grandpa could have had a pair of pants without Pat's knees and had some store-bought tobacco. But when we were boys, we'd come through here, starting at that big beech tree I talked about a while ago, and there was a road in the woods. We call them sled roads or haul roads. And we come along that, and it was all solid woods, and those trees that were big enough to make sled soles 70 years ago are now big 2-foot, 3-foot trees, white oak trees. So you came through the woods and you came to another clear place up here, and the bars where we went through to go to our place, there was a little old 2-room General Inn house right there by the bars where a lot of people had lived in different times, and we had a garden there. And in a little bit, I'm sure Mike will be able to get a picture of the rocks that they carried out of that garden. and then we passed through and passed that little house, and then we came into our property where Dad and Mother lived. And the first field we came to was so poor that it wouldn't even grow good blackberries. It was what they had called worn out. And then when you got back on the hill, there was good land back there, and an enterprising farmer could have made a living, because when we came to this place, there were 2 good apple orchards on it, and there was places, benches that you could run a mowing machine on, and they were rich. The soil was rich, and you could have raised cattle and raised your own feed, and made a living on that farm. Right where Marshall's standing now is a pile of rock that was taken out of the garden that went with the little 2-room house that stood right back here about 50 yards. And this over here, you can see the bank right here. That's where the sled road went, that we hauled our whatever we hauled, coal, groceries, everything else, on a sled, because I could only remember 2 or 3 times that we had a wagon, a road wagon, back on that hill. The rest of the time, anything you hauled had to be dragged on a sled. I could tell you a funny little story about that 2-room house. They said in the old days, when Uncle Con, who was my dad's first cousin, and his brother came up here, there was a man that lived in this little house that had girls, and he didn't allow them to go to dances or anything. So the boys needed some girls to go to a dance with them one night, and they came up here, and they gave him 50 cents to let 2 of his girls go to the dance with them. And they said when they got down here to the bars, about where we're standing now, the old man was singing, "A little talk with Jesus will make it right all right." I mentioned a little bit ago a 2-room house that used to stand here. And here are the rocks from the chimney. This big rock, look at this, that big, is part of the chimney foundation. They're all piled right in here. Now I know this was looks like hard and poor, and a poor way to go, but in those days everybody lived about the same, and they didn't pay any attention to having a hard way. Just as long as they had a warm place and enough to eat, they were somewhat satisfied. Well, I think I've already said that that's where the sled road across the creek. You see, everything that we used in this house back here, we had to haul on a sled or carry on horses, just like they do when you see on TV about the old cowboys. Anyway, this is where that sled road crossed this little branch and went up that steep hill over there into an old field. Now, you can see the woods up there now, but when I was a boy, that was a clear field, and it had been used so much that it was worn out, it wouldn't even grow good blackberry vines. But I came down that hill one day with the horse and sled, going down to the creek, down to Grandpa's house to get something that we needed, and I wasn't supposed to ride on the sled, but I just sat out on it a little bit, and something happened that I fell, and the sled ran up on the horse's legs, and well, I jumped off the sled, and I guess I fell because the sled ran up on the horse's legs, and I was on the ground on my belly. I knew better than to turn loose of the lines that was guiding the horse, because she would have run off and the sled would have been ruined, and she probably would have been too. So I held on to her, and the sled got right up on her hind legs and rode her from the top of that bank down to the creek, and I held to the lines, and she dragged me. Then when she got down here and the sled quit bothering her, she quit trying to get away. So I went down to Grandpa's and told him about it, and we got whatever it was that I came to get. And he doctored up my skin places, and he said to me, "Now we won't tell Eric, will we?" Eric was Dad.
Now, why did he tell you that, Uncle Clement?
Because he knew my dad would have skinned me for sitting down on the sled to ride down the hill like that and letting it run up on the horse. And he thought it'd be better if we didn't tell him. Well, we're looking down the hill now into the brush, but the road that we used to get up to the house that's behind us here came right up through what we call the briar patch field. It was poor, it wouldn't raise any crops, it wouldn't hardly raise blackberries. But as we got up to the edge of that field, we heard a rooster squawking, and when we got up there, we found the feathers, and my mother knew that rooster had been caught by a fox, and so she told me that I had to kill it. And I don't know whether I'd killed a rabbit or a squirrel yet or not. I know that when I carried a shotgun, I had to carry a single barrel shotgun, broken down, and carry the shell in my fingers, like that, ready to stick it in if something jumped out. But anyway, that was on Sunday, and Monday morning, I took the two fox dogs, Tip and Crook, went to the top of the Taylor Ridge over there, and in a little bit they had that fox going, and a little bit longer, I can see him yet, he was pacing like a horse. He paced right up through the brush and right into the path, and I shot, made a very lucky shot, because if it had been 2 or 3 inches either way, I'd have missed him. But it shot him right behind the forelegs. It took all these organs out. They were hanging on to him and lying on the ground. And I, of course, was a proud man and a boy as I brought that fox in to show it to my mother.
How old were you, Uncle Clement?
I think I was 14. We're standing here where the old well. It was a dug well about 15 feet deep, about 30 inches across and walled up with sandstones. And we got a supply of water from that year round, and it never went dry. And as a matter of interest, there was a russet apple tree that stood right there, right beside the well. And we'd come out and Dad would sit up the cider press, and we used some of those apples. We had 2 good orchards on the place, and make all kinds of apple cider. But this is the well. It had nothing around it now, but in those days it had a box around it and a windlass.
Previously said we moved here in the spring of 1924, and I was 7 years old in December of that year. So that was my first year on the farm, and I can vividly remember they put out a big crop. I can vividly remember taking a hoe and going to the cornfield at least every day anybody else
Every
went.
day. 7 years old.
Stayed in that cornfield all day long.
He had a
mowing corn.
He had a little hoe that had a blue broom handle in it for a handle. Just a little thin hoe. It might have cut a weed, but he was expected at 7 years old to just go right along and hoe corn like everybody else and go every day. That there was something like that he could do, and then every day my dad took me with him to do whatever he was going to do. And
It didn't get any easier for the young ones either. We did it right on up.
You went up the hill both ways to school.
That's right.
But that was a hard year. We were came out here that spring, 1924, and tried to put out a crop. And I heard them say, of course I was only 11 or going on 11, and I wouldn't know, but I heard them say that it rained on 27 days in May that year. We didn't get our crop out. It was the 4th of July when we hoed it all for the first time. You're supposed to have your corn laid by long before that. But Ode and Bob and Tom and Doc, I think all of them, came out here and helped us hoe out in the big field by the old barn.
I remember one incident that I want to relate. And then I got up, I had a little sweat rag hanging in my back pocket all the time. And I got up one morning and Mom and Dad were sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast. And Mom looked at me and smiled, and Dad said, "You can put that sweat rag away. You won't have to use it today. It had a big rain the night before and we couldn't hoe corn the next day." You never saw a little boy so happy in
Yeah,
all
right.
your life.
And in June, Bob and I staged
June's
the
good.
first strike that was ever staged on Willis Creek.
Tell them that one.
And you live to tell about it?
Dad always observed all the holidays, and 4th of July, Christmas, and all were great, and he enjoyed them, and he relaxed, and everything was pleasant on those days. But this day, he had been working over at Walgrove, and we had to hoe the corn out, he said. So he took us to the field to hoe corn. We didn't have any watermelon, we didn't have any soft drink, we didn't have anything. And after a while, poor old Mommy came to the field carrying a bucket of lemonade made with this well water, and we refused to drink it. We wouldn't participate in the 4th of July celebration, and because we didn't want to work on the 4th of July, so we staged the strike, and he was going to whip us to make us drink lemonade, and Mother wouldn't let him. That's true.
I wasn't as much of a striker as I was a follower. I watched Clement. I'd have been afraid, but he got his lips down on that glass, and I can remember this distinctly. Instead of swallowing it, he'd and he had the lemonade would run all over the place. He wouldn't drink the lemonade. And of course, they were concentrating on him, and I didn't have to. I was just standing there as a little boy. I vividly remember that. Vividly remember that.
I mean, he expected me to catch it. You know, 7 foot big. You know what? It was still the same when I was a kid.
Well, when I was 8 years old, he had a Hereford bull, and why he decided to lead that bull to water, I don't know, because it was already mean. But he took a short-handled pitchfork in one hand and put a ring up bull's nose and started to water with it, and put me behind it with a pitchfork for me to keep it in line. But when the bull got fractious, I went in on the porch and stood behind Molly. He was out there fighting that bull. "You're not taking this, are you?"
No?
Well, that's enough.
He was out there fighting that bull, and a couple of the men came along that worked in the area, and they got it back in the barn. But now, think an 8-year-old kid with a 1,800-pound Hereford bull and a short-handled pitchfork.
And a 28-year-old man or 30, whatever he was, trying to lead a bull like that to water when he could have carried him a bucket.
He just
In the
decided
barn.
they need exercise or something.
Yeah.
Well,
I can tell you one.
well,
Molly
not
said, "You ain't got a bit of sense."
He
sure.
sent
To him.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Orville could have
Well, he
been
did it a
5.
lot of times.
Orville could have been 5. And we have to mention Orville a few times in this. Orville could have been 5 years old. And for those, Orville is Randy and Stuart's father. He was the 3rd child next to me. And they sent Orville after the horses one day. He was 5 years old, he was 100. And he went around the head of that hollow that we just came around through. And he got one of them and he got on it. And he rode that horse right up to the bars. And I'll never forget Mom telling us.
On the dead run.
Yeah, on the dead run. He pulled back on that halter, and the horse had a halter on, and said, "Whoa, baby." And the horse stopped, and he got off. You know what Dad did? Came out and kicked his rear end, sent him after the horse. He just brought one. He's supposed to bring him both.
Hey. You, this is a mason jar, a piece of a mason jar, Clem. The lid, look here. Right there is a mason jar. Found it right here by the old well. You've probably eaten off of that plate in your time.
part of the it's part of the jar cap, isn't it?
Yeah. Or a plate.
Ate-
Probably the jar.
Ate berries out of that jar, for sure.
Oh, when my daddy got his job at Walgrove, of course we moved over there, but we had to come back over here and pick berries and gather fruit and take it to Walgrove. So one year, my mother canned 85 gallons of blackberries. So we picked those and carried them from here up that hollow yonder and out over the hill and down the ridge and down Riley Branch to Walgrove, which I'd say it was a good 2.5 or 3 miles that we, after we picked berries all day, we carried them over there to Walgrove. And I used to say there was a row of locust trees right along that ridge back there between the fields, and I used to say that's where I wanted to be buried, because that's where we would rest in the shade of those trees, and there was the coolest bluegrass there, and it was peaceful, and I thought that that'd be a good place to spend eternity. I mean, whatever spends eternity.
Well, we can still put you back there.
You know where I'm going? April 1924. We lived in South Charleston. Dad had sold the dairy, and we moved across the river into South Charleston. Moved over there in January. Stayed there till April, and June and I went to South Charleston schools. And the funny thing is that we had saved Arbuckle coupons, Arbuckle coffee coupon, and ordered baseball gloves. And it must have been the day after we mailed them in that we started stopping at the post office as we came home from school there at the Indian Mound in South Charleston and asking about those baseball gloves. And it got so that the postman would see us come in the door and he'd start laughing and say, "They're not here yet, boys." But finally they came, and mine was a tan one and Bob's was a gray one, so we got them. Then they bought this farm with mother's inheritance. They bought the farm. We decided to move out here. So on the 23rd of April, mother took all the other children, and she was down to Charlotte by then, and she was pregnant with Margaret. She took those children and went up to what they call Wilson Station. It was on the railroad right there at Connor's Greenhouse now. Uncle Con had a dairy and she went up there and spent the night, and Dad and I left South Charleston with a team of horses and farm implements on the wagon and a cow tied behind it, and drove up to Wilson Station at Uncle Con's, and we spent the night. The next morning, boy, there are lots of things that happened there that ought to be told. For instance, I had a game rooster, and there's a story a mile long with that, but I'll just be brief. That this game rooster and Clyde and Rome, Ain't Hattie's boys, wanted that rooster so bad that they offered me everything, even up to a .22 rifle, and I wouldn't trade him, and brought him up here to the country and got hired up for salt and soda and took him to the store and got 50 cents for him. But anyway, we left there the next morning at daylight, just light enough to see the horses. I had the cow and the implements, and we started, and the road was all dirt road, remember, in 1924. And I rode the wagon with Dad, and the boys, Uncle Con, had given us 2 foxhound pups that never were worth a nickel, but they were good looking pups. And they'd get in a fight under the floor as long as they lived, and you'd have to go under there and punch them out. So on the way up here, we stopped and ate lunch. The best bite of cheese and crackers and Coke that I ever had in my life. We had to cross the river there at Big Chimney because they were working on the Elk River Road, what's now Route 4. We had to cross the road to Big Chimney and go around the Pinch. And we stopped over there on the Reamer Hill to eat our lunch, and I dropped some cheese and cracker crumbs in that box, and those pups got in a fight, and Dad had to tear the slats off and take them up, pull them apart, and then when you put them back in, they didn't fight anymore. But anyway, it took us from daylight to almost to about 6 o'clock in the evening to get from Wilson Station to Wills Creek. So that's how we got moved into here. The next day we started hauling the stuff out here to the house that stood right there where those weeds are, and which burned a few years ago. I'm standing on what was the hearth, the fireplace that was in this house. We heated it by burning wood. Of course, it wasn't very big. It was only a kitchen and 2 bedrooms. It used the big bedroom for the sitting around the fire. We lived in this house in 1924, and Margaret was born here in this house in June of 1924. The day she was born, we hoed corn, Robert and Dad and I, down in what they call the Little Red Field. What it was a red clay field. It was full of slips. It was almost dangerous to work a horse in it. But we worked there, and we worked till supper time and came home, and Mother had our supper ready. We ate, and then I took all of them and went to Grandma's and spent the night. And when we got back, Margaret had been born.
I'm standing on the old house seat right here. And right here is an interesting piece of the chimney, or we call it the flue. You'll notice a small hole cut through there with some sort of a tool. It must be 18 inches deep, which requires some time. It was a good sandstone, probably selected from the best sandstone in the country.
We're now at the Woodall Cemetery. This land was given for a cemetery by Uncle Henry Woodall and Aunt Sarah Douglas. And of course, Aunt Sarah was a Woodall. But everybody on Wills Creek that wanted a place to be buried had used this cemetery. Most of the Humphrey side of our family are buried here. We're just a short distance, maybe 200 or 300 yards from where Dad was born and reared, and a mile from where Mother was born and reared. Here on Wills Creek, just over the hill from Elkview. That's Mother and Dad. Mikey's grandparents. Who was Grandma Humphrey's, Grandma Woodall Humphrey's brother.
Okay.
This is the grave of Robert Edward. When I was a boy, they called it Burdett, but when they got a little educated, they started calling it Burdett. But he was my mother's stepfather. Actually reared her from the time she was about 2 or 3 years old. This is Elizabeth James Brookman, who's my mother's mother, but her husband, Louis Brookman, died when my mother was about 2 years old, and she married Ed Burdett, and he made a home for him on Grandpa Brookman's property. This is my mother's brother, Kerry Brookman. He was born with a handicap. I can't think of the right word right now. It was probably one of those common diseases. It might have been polio. See? But Grandma said he was born with it. But he walked with his knees together like that and dragged his feet. Uncle Henry Woodall was Grandma Woodall Humphrey's brother. This is my great grandfather. He was the father of Josephine Humphreys Woodall. She's your great grandmother. I mean, he's your great grandfather.
Okay.
And this is his wife, his second wife, Martha. They came here from over on from Tupper's Creek, but actually